And there we go. It started. Okay. Good morning, everyone. This is Generation Vatican II. I am Alex Clark, and today we have a special guest with us, Michael Lofton from Reason and Theology. Michael is a graduate of Christendom College Graduate School of Theology, where he received his Master of the Arts in Theological Studies, cum laude, in 2018. He is currently working on a doctorate in theology with Pontifex University and is writing a dissertation on the magisterium of the Catholic Church. Michael is the founder of the St. Maximus the Confessor Institute and Reason and Theology show, where he has interviewed many of the leading figures in contemporary theology. He has also appeared on EWTN, Catholic Answers, Sirius XM Radio, Radio Maria, and has contributed frequently to various newspapers and websites. Michael, welcome to the show. How you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, great to see you. I am so happy that we get to talk. I've really been a big fan of yours for a while now, and this is terrific to actually get to talk with you here. So
yeah, honored to be here. I appreciate it.
Yeah, rock on, man. So we've been going through Lumen Gentium in season 3 of Generation Vatican II, which is kind of why I've asked you to come on here, because as I've been watching your show and listening to you talk, you have brought it up many times. So you also talk a lot about just the Second Vatican Council. So depending on how much time we have at the end here, we may get a little bit into just general Vatican II questions there. But in the meantime, hey, we're capping off season 3 with Lumen Gentium, so let's get into it. First off, I'd like to ask a rather broad question specifically about you. You actually first joined the Eastern Orthodox, one of the Eastern Orthodox churches, and then went from that to Catholicism. So I was wondering, why didn't you go to Eastern Catholicism instead of straight into the Latin Church?
Well, I had originally been Protestant, and then I went Catholic back in 2012. But in 2017, I had a detour in Eastern Orthodoxy for various reasons, which we can get into. But ultimately, I continued to study the issues, and the objective truth claims of the Catholic Church just continued to press against me, and I had to, I found myself at the position where I felt I really needed to be reconciled to Rome and re-enter back into full communion, which I did in 2019. So I think it was late 2019, somewhere around there. And you asked the question, well, why didn't I go the Eastern Catholic route? I probably would have if I had an Eastern Catholic parish available, but they're just too far away from me. The closest one is about 4 hours away, so it's just not very practical. So I just go to a Latin Rite parish.
Gotcha. And do you prefer the traditional Latin Mass or the Novus Ordo?
That's a good question. If we're talking about the traditional Latin Mass compared to your average Novus Ordo, traditional Latin Mass any day. Now, if we're talking about the Novus Ordo done properly, maybe like at St. John Cantius, I don't know if you're familiar with their parish, but they do the extraordinary form and the ordinary form, and both of them very well. If you compare them, the two, the traditional Latin Mass and the Novus Ordo done properly, that's a tougher one. So I would say ultimately there's no major substantial differences there. So I wouldn't be upset to go to either, to be honest. But when it comes to what my preferences are, just as far as personal preferences, I really prefer the Byzantine liturgy over the Latin liturgy. Now, that wasn't always the case. I used to prefer the more Latin style liturgy, Latin Rite. But I don't know, the Byzantine liturgy just really grew on me when I took that detour to Orthodoxy, and it's always just stuck. So I guess I prefer, if we're just talking about preferences, Eastern.
Just like what appeals to you most?
Probably Byzantine liturgy.
Liturgy? Gotcha, yeah. Okay, hey, there's no problem with that.
But it's a preference. I'd be happy to go to a traditional Latin Mass or a Novus Ordo that's done properly, or an Eastern Rite parish. So
I'm familiar with John Cantius for my parents have gone to it a couple times, so they know the name of it. But then I also had the opportunity to interview Austin Suggs, shout out to Gospel Simplicity, who kind of like jumped into the foray of Catholicism by like accidentally going to John Cantius.
I heard about
which
that.
is, a phenomenal opportunity to be like, oh, I'm just going to take a step into a Catholic church. Oh, what's this? This is absolutely beautiful. Yeah, lucky duck.
Right.
So that's how I'm familiar with it. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, I got to visit them a few years ago, and I got to see how they did the extraordinary form and also the ordinary form, and they did both very well. I wouldn't mind going to either one of theirs.
Rock on.
Yeah.
So in my experience, I think I definitely prefer the Novus Ordo because, like, being a generic American, I find the Latin rite to be very obtuse and obscure.
Yep.
Like obscure, not in like, oh, it's obscuring the mystery of God. No, like obscure, like I don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
And there's a big conversation that I plan on having with David Bates of Pints with Jack in a little bit. About actually he's a mutual friend of ours.
Oh yeah.
So he and I were going to talk about the ability to like understand what's going on and the various rites coming up in the next month or so. So yeah, like the ability to just understand what's going on, and the fact that like the Latin rite, the Latin form was the lingua franca of when it was developed, and then all the different churches are done more or less in the language of that place. Like I feel like, okay, you should be doing it in your vernacular, which for us would be English. So I just find it that much easier to, attend mass.
When I first converted to Catholicism, I definitely preferred the Novus Ordo for that reason. And I did not understand the traditional Latin Mass, and I thought it was a barrier. In fact, it was a barrier for me. I constantly asked the question, how could the church have this as its liturgy for so long? If I had lived 100 years ago, I would have to go to one of these if I were in the West, and I just can't reconcile that with what I believe to be the proper form of worship. So for a while, I struggled with the traditional Latin Mass when I first converted, but I kind of worked through some issues. But I do see the importance of the vernacular to an extent. And I do see that there were some needs to reform certain liturgical practices and aspects. So I'm in favor of the liturgical reform. I think that some things could have been done better, though.
Yeah. So like, okay, so let's get into some of the stuff we were talking about for Lumen Gentium. Like the ability to worship in your vernacular language. I feel like that is a necessary item in worshiping God, like because you need to understand what you're saying and what you're doing when you worship God. Contrast that with the standard FSSP or SSPX attendee. It seems like, if I could paint with too broad of a brushstroke, they almost fetishize the Latin language as being like extra holy, and I feel like that's not appropriate. No language on earth is any better to worship God than any other language, broadly speaking, because like human language doesn't have any, intrinsic quality that makes it better or worse to worship God in,
Yeah, I think some people go a little too far with it. I understand the values of Latin. John the 23rd issued a document right before the Second Vatican Council, or was it 64, somewhere around there. It was right around that time. Issued a really good document on the importance of the Latin language, and I wholeheartedly affirm it. But I would also agree with you insofar as I think it's important that we worship in a language that we understand. Now, some might say, well, you could learn Latin. Okay, there are some things that maybe we can learn Latin. And in fact, I believe it was the Second Vatican Council or especially the liturgical reform after Vatican II, that emphasized the fact that, we're going to have the vernacular, but we should still know how to pray to our Father in Latin and certain things in Latin. So I kind of want to balance those out, but I completely get where you're coming from when it comes to the importance of worshiping in a language that we understand. I also understand what they're trying to emphasize when it comes to the importance of having a universal language, but not at the expense of us understanding what's taking place in the liturgy and what's being said in the liturgy. So I kind of want to balance those out, but I lean in favor of having parts that are relevant to things that we're going to say in the liturgy. That should be mostly done in the vernacular. And I'm okay with occasional parts here and there being in Latin, especially some of the maybe silent prayers of the priest.
Yeah. So with that, moving into Lumen Gentium talks a lot about like the Pope being the visible sign of unity in the church, okay? And a lot of the references hammer on this point. Like the point of us having a Pope, the point of that office is to be the visible sign of unity, what makes Catholics Catholic. You, the layperson, are in unity with your priest, your parish priest, who is in union with your diocesan bishop, who is in union with the Pope. And that's how we all form the Catholic Church in unity together through this one head. For the example of SSPX, I wonder how much, I guess, I mean, you can always say like fundamentally there still is that unity, right? But like, do you think that unity is waning? Is there like too much discontent with the Pope or the popes for the past 20 years since Vatican II that would somehow like injure this sign of unity within the church to the rest of the secular world?
Would the behavior of the popes injure that unity, or our lack of piety towards the Pope injure it? If you can clarify that for me.
Yeah.
Because I
think it's ultimately our behavior towards him, because we are the ones we are the ones who are acting out against the directives and teachings of the Pope, acting within his office. So it would be our impetus.
Yeah, I agree. I think that in a lot of cases, we are reacting sometimes to misunderstandings of what a Pope may say, and we go a little bit too far in our criticisms to the extent that it does impact our unity with the Chair of St. Peter. If you look at Bishop Gasser, I don't have it pulled up in front of me, but if you go to Bishop Gasser's relatio, his speech that he issued at the First Vatican Council, if you go to it and just maybe type in the section where it uses the keyword "sea of pestilence," if you go to that section, in that paragraph, he talks about the importance of the Chair of St. Peter as a center of unity. One of the most important roles of the papacy is to be a center of unity for all of the different local churches spread throughout the world. And whenever we overly criticize the Pope, I think we begin to harm that unity. That being said, there is an extent that we can criticize the Holy Father. I just think that oftentimes we go way beyond the permitted extent. And we also probably misunderstand a great deal of what comes from the Chair of St. Peter and are probably too quick to judge. But I definitely think that it is impacting unity in the church.
So you had sent a tweet out a little bit ago about asking about if there's any interest to talk about the hierarchy of papal documents. And I think that kind of plays into our conversation here.
Yeah.
I'll be honest, I've been doing this for a year now, and I don't know, like, I have a rough idea of the hierarchy of papal documents. Like, what can you give us a quick rundown? Like, what's the highest, what's the lowest, and even the lowest, like, how much authority should we take this with?
You know, an apostolic constitution is definitely one of the highest when it comes to papal documents. There's different kinds of magisterial documents, papal or conciliar. If we're speaking about papal apostolic constitutions, pretty high, if not the highest. Just kind of depends on what he's doing. But usually whenever he's speaking on faith and morals, it's an apostolic constitution. Lowest would probably be something like a papal homily, arguably, right? Some might push back on that and say, okay, well, I don't think that's magisterial. With the proper qualifications, I would definitely place it within his magisterium. And maybe we could argue for maybe some lower levels below a papal homily, but that's extremely debated. So there's a range between, say, an apostolic constitution and perhaps a papal homily. There's a range of authority or degrees or weightiness by which he may teach. And by the way, an apostolic constitution, a lot of people have heard of those as papal bulls. They're not necessarily identical, but people have probably heard more about a papal bull than they have an apostolic constitution. A bull was just the seal, usually a lead seal, although there were different kinds of seals that could be used. It was just a seal that was used at the end of the document, and they are often used for apostolic constitutions. And then there are also conciliar documents. A constitution of the church issued by an ecumenical council would probably be the highest, although you could argue a profession of faith issued by an ecumenical council might even be slightly higher than a constitution issued by an ecumenical council. And then they can go, lower in degrees of authority. You have decrees and things like that, for example, that you could see at Vatican II. So there's a range of conciliar documents that have been issued historically. And again, they vary in their weightiness. And what's curious, though, is you could issue a definitive teaching within any kind of document. Usually, though, if the Pope does it, it's within an apostolic constitution. But frankly, the Pope could issue a definitive teaching, something ex cathedra, in a papal homily if he wanted. I mean, no Pope has ever done so. And he would need to make it explicitly clear that he's doing so for us to know it, since it's so irregular. But frankly, any way in which he teaches in his magisterium, he could issue something definitive. So there's a lot of ways in which we could come at this. We could speak of definitive teachings, non-definitive teachings, and then when it comes to those non-definitive teachings, we can speak of a hierarchy of weight when it comes to the document in which they're in. And then those aren't the only measures that dictate how authoritative and weighty a teaching is. The document in which it's issued factors in, but there are other factors as well.
Yeah. So, okay. On that note, you had Jimmy Akin on your show, and he said there are something like, depending on how you count them, 4 to 15 ex cathedra document statements, and he leaned more on the side of like that there were possibly 8. I've only heard of 2: the Immaculate Conception and Assumption of Mary. How many do you think there are? If you had to,
the 15 number, I could see somebody saying that. I mean, of course, you have things like the Tome of Leo, or Agatho at the Sixth Council, or Augustinus. Whenever Augustinus was definitively interpreted by the Pope, I forget which Pope it was offhand. Unum Sanctum. There's a few other documents we could issue, or that we could mention beyond just those 2 that some would know. So I mean, I'm fine with somebody saying 15, although I might push back and challenge that a little bit more, because Gasser, again, in his Relatio at Vatican I, thinks that there are thousands upon thousands of definitive papal teachings. And you ask, okay, well, how can that be? Well, there's what's called global censors. It's not something we hear often about, especially, after the Second Vatican Council. You definitely don't see these a whole lot. But prior to the Second Vatican Council, they used censors to condemn certain propositions. And then you would have what's called a global censor, where you condemn a whole bunch of propositions in one fell swoop, if you will. Instead of condemning them individually, you just condemn the whole thing. It's called the global censor. Well, if you count all of those global censors and every one of the individual propositions that could be condemned, perhaps definitively, we could start to add up a whole bunch of ex cathedra teachings of a
so it's not like
that goes way beyond 15. So it kind of depends on how are we defining these things. What I like more than just okay, well, how many ex cathedra teachings are there? What I like just discussing, and the way I like to phrase it is, did the Pope propose this definitively? I like using that language a little bit better. And I think that there's a whole bunch of things that the Pope has put forward definitively beyond just 15, maybe solemn ex cathedra declarations.
Okay, so something you just said there. This is like my biggest irksome moment with Catholicism, and frankly, the best argument against Catholicism that I've thought of.
Uh-huh.
We have this idea of sacred tradition. We have this idea of like definitive teaching outside of sacred scripture. Okay, cool. But we don't know what that is. Like we haven't ever said, yeah, like to make a dogmatic teaching that everyone has to accept and believe, this is what you say. Instead, we have these arguments about like, well, are there 4 ex-cathedra statements? Are there 15? Was anything definitively taught at Second Vatican Council? Like, actually, I was really happy that in Lumen Gentium, in the appendix, it says like these are the things that are explicitly definitively taught, and then you'd Control F that phrase, and you only get one thing. You know, like. Why is this a problem in Catholicism that we don't know what we teach definitively?
It's a really good question, although I would say it's not as bad as it sounds. I think it is a little bit more clear cut than that. But before I maybe go into that, let me just note, let's just pretend for the moment that it is somewhat ambiguous. The point, however, is we can always go to the current living magisterium and ask for clarification, and it could issue a definitive answer, and one that is so abundantly clear that we can know whether this is definitive or not.
Yeah.
So somebody, asks the Holy See, okay, wait, is Ordinatio Sacerdotalis definitive? Right? I mean, we can get, and in fact have received, a clear-cut answer from the magisterium. And if somebody pushes back and says, well, what if that's ambiguous? Okay, we can go back to the living magisterium and ask for further clarification until the point that it's so painfully clear that we know this proposition is definitive. Mm-hmm. Now, so there's definitely something objectively superior to the Catholic claim that's able to provide that, as opposed to maybe sola scriptura, where I can't ask my Bible, hey, is this what you mean? I mean, I know what you're proposing is definitive, but is this what you mean when you say that? I can't ask my Bible that, but I can ask a living magisterium. So there is something objectively better when it comes to the Catholic teaching authority than non-Catholics. But the question still remains, is it really so unclear that we can really have these debates on what's definitive? Part of it is, Vatican I gives us certain parameters to determine what is ex cathedra. It does give us some general parameters, but it deliberately chose not to give a set formula. The reason why is there has never been a set formula used historically for papal definitive teachings. So you can't give a set formula, at least not one that applies for the last 2,000 years. Maybe we could say, okay, from now on, if you're going to teach definitively, use this set formula. Maybe we could do that from here on out, but you look at Leo's tome, he's not using a set formula, but is it clear that he thought that he was teaching something definitive? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, would that not be ex cathedra, at least according to the definition that's offered by Vatican I? I would argue so. So I think in many cases it is clear cut, but there might be some occasional, questions here and there. Is this a definitive proposition or not? And in those more rare cases, if there's any ambiguity, we can always go to the living magisterium and ask. Okay, gotcha. Thank you. That's a good clarification. I'd like to jump ahead quick to the concept of weaponized ambiguity, because a lot of critiques of the Second Vatican Council is like, oh, it was deliberately ambiguous in its teaching or lack thereof, because they would slide something like that into, and therefore, like they made it possible for people to skew the wording later on to their own devious intentions. Okay, so I'd like to talk about that.
I don't think it was deliberately ambiguous. I think I'm trying to propose something else in season 3, which is that they proposed characteristics on various teachings for various, whatever topic, characteristics, so that they wouldn't exclude anything unnecessarily. And that this is like in engineering, so I'm trained as an engineer. In engineering, we would call this like a solution agnostic proposal. So if you say like, hey, I want my kids to like swing on the tree outside. Okay, well, a swing, that's, a plastic seat with 2 ropes, right? What color do you want the ropes? What color do you want the seat? Well, what about a tire swing, and the tire swing, like, well, is the tire hanging vertically or is the tire hanging sideways? Like there are a bunch of different ways that you can swing. You can have a rope swing, these are solution agnostic. You have to phrase the proposed solution in a solution agnostic manner so as to not rule out other potential options. Mm-hmm. So my proposal for the Second Vatican Council was that it was not ambiguous. It was solution agnostic in its characteristics.
Yeah. I would agree. The language of weaponized ambiguity, of course, comes from a claim that Skillebeck was making. And in fact, he was saying that he was in fact quoting somebody else who he said, this other person was telling me that this is what he wants at the council. And it was an individual who had absolutely no authority to really stir things up and phrase things in the council documents in an ambiguous way. And it wasn't something that was happening all over the place. He's just referencing one guy who said this, who didn't really have any voting power or influence. And he in fact disagreed with it. Skillebeck didn't even agree with him on the matter. So I think that what's happened is they've latched on to that and turned it into something it's not, as if that there's all these ticking time bombs in Vatican II all over the place, and there's all these pariti that just are deliberately making things ambiguous, and they intend to all just use it later on as if there's this big plot of conspiracy. That's just not happening. Now, if we speak about, the term, I think the term you used was solution agnostic.
Yeah.
Was it? Yeah. That's a good way of putting it. But even if somebody wants to say, well, some of the things that it chose, some of the language that it chose to use was somewhat ambiguous. Okay, but not any more so than other councils. That's the thing. We can speak of other councils using ambiguity, or whatever term you want to use. We can speak of the church choosing not to give an answer on certain issues and deliberately wording things in a way that leaves them open. Mm-hmm. We can talk about that with pretty much every council historically. So Vatican II is really no different there. And if we're going to knock Vatican II for that, we have to do that with Nicaea I. We have to do that with Chalcedon. We have to do that with Trent and a whole bunch of other councils.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Thank you. Hey, I want to wind the clock back a little bit here. So Vatican II and whether or not it actually taught anything definitively. So you said, I can find it here, Gentium 21, always bring up that this is a definitive teaching in the Second Vatican Council regarding the sacramentality of the episcopate. Now, Article 21 it's 2 paragraphs long. I don't want to read the entire thing here. You know, what exactly in there are you saying is like the definitive teaching? Did you know?
Well, yeah, it starts out, the Sacred Council teaches, that part right there. See if you can spot that real quick. I don't have it pulled up in front of me. I can probably pull it up here. But it starts, the Sacred Council teaches. Do you see that part?
And the Sacred Council teaches that by episcopal consecration, the fullness of the sacrament of orders is conferred. That fullness of power, namely, which both in the church's liturgical practice and in the language of the fathers of the church is called the high priesthood, the supreme power of the sacred ministry.
Yeah, that proposition would be definitively proposed by the Second Vatican Council and was not considered definitive prior to the Second Vatican Council.
Gotcha.
So we can speak about the church teaching something infallibly there at Vatican II.
So I love how there are like 18 subordinate clauses in this. So this is saying, if I can chop this down, the Sacred Council is teaching that episcopal consecration, by episcopal consecration, the fullness of the sacrament of orders is conferred the supreme power of the sacred ministry. So just
and
episcopal
it's
consecration
distinct from
is the supreme practice and like the pinnacle of power of ministry,
as opposed to the ordination of a priest. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Prior to that, that was a debated topic. I mean, is they would kind of ask the question, I guess you could put it this way: is the ordination of bishop a higher or a weightier, if you will, receiving of the sacrament of ordination, or is it the same as the sacrament of ordination of the priesthood? Well, what they're wanting to say is no. The receiving of ordination for a bishop is the highest form of ordination, of the sacrament of ordination, and the priesthood is a lower expression of it. But again, prior to Vatican II, that was debated, whereas after Vatican II, that's definitively proposed. And I would argue it's definitively proposed, number one, by the relative language, relatively solemn language that's used there. The Sacred Council teaches. That's relatively solemn language for Vatican II. Now, it wouldn't be a dogma. It would be what we would call Catholic doctrine, a secondary object of infallibility. But those can still be taught infallibly, and I would say that was taught there. Number two, if you look at Pope Paul VI, there at Vatican II, I think it was the speech in the opening speech of the third session, I believe, he mentions that the council in Lumen Gentium 20, he doesn't name paragraph 21, but it's what he's talking about. He says the council is going to decide this issue about the episcopate in a way that could no longer be challenged. Now, what does that mean, in a way that could no longer be challenged? Is he talking about could no longer be challenged tentatively or definitively? I think he means definitively, and that's the way a lot of other people understood it. So I would say those are indications that Vatican II defined, well, yeah, you could say defined something there definitively.
Okay, well, since I have Mr. Nuance himself, I'm gonna tee up an argument here to try and say you're wrong.
Okay, let's hear it.
So you're saying that Lumen Gentium 21 is an example of something that was definitively taught. Now, you said maybe not dogma, but you're saying maybe it's a doctrine.
It's definitely not dogma, but as Catholic doctrine, which is an object of infallibility. Secondary objects are objects of infallibility. Yeah.
We're going to put that right here. I want to come back to that and talk about that, okay?
Okay.
So I referenced earlier how the appendix specifically says what is declared to be believed by everyone. So in the appendix, taking conciliar custom into consideration and also the pastoral purpose of the present council, the Sacred Council defines as binding on the church only those things that matter in faith and morals, which it shall openly declare to be binding.
There you go.
So
that's the key.
Faith and morals, and it has to say that it's binding.
That's the key. Openly declare to be binding. That's key.
Okay. So declared to be binding. I did not see binding anywhere in Lumen Gentium 21.
Sure.
However, in Lumen Gentium 14, the bonds which bind men to the church in a visible way are profession of faith, the sacraments, and ecclesial government and communion. So I feel like that is definitively taught then, because it binds you to the church, and the church says this binds you. Like, this is something we are declaring to be emphatically must be believed.
But you can openly declare that something is binding without using that language verbatim, right? I mean, you can communicate that by way of the language that's used. It would become clear that that's the intention. And I would say when it uses the term, when it uses the phrase, I should say, the Sacred Council teaches, that's historically been considered language that would indicate a solemn definition.
Okay.
That's how that's historically been understood.
So
The
maybe,
Sacred Council teaches, the Sacred Council proposes. You can see that kind of language in Trent for definitive teaching. So whenever you hear that, you should automatically think this is possibly a definition. And in fact, that's how Paul VI understood it, and quite a few other theologians understood it.
so maybe when the appendix says like these are the things that are binding, like yes, these are things that are binding. There may be other things that are binding, and we're not emphatically defining them right now, but there may be other things. But these emphatically are. And so that's the thing I just read from, what was it, 17? Okay.
Yeah, and I think that this is one of them, paragraph 21. But if somebody were to come and say, okay, well, I don't think that was definitively proposed, although I would give a lot of pushback on it, it's not a deal breaker at the end of the day. Okay, at the very least, though, one has to give religious submission of intellect and will, and an extremely high version of it. In other words, nobody could dissent from it, right? But we could question whether or not this could be reformed in the future. And I don't think that it could be reformed. I think this was an irreformable teaching. But if somebody just really pushed back and said, no, I think it could be reformed in the future, but I tentatively give submission of intellect. Oh, okay. That's fine. So not a big deal. At the end of the day, we're still assenting to it. I just think you should offer a higher assent to it. But
yeah. Now, isn't there something different between like something that is declared to be binding or defined versus like taught? Like teaching definitions and declarations, like those are all kind of, I feel like you've talked before about like, oh, well, this is, maybe a non-dogmatic definitive teaching, or I guess that would be the doctrine you just mentioned with 21.
Yeah, that would be an example.
Or maybe this is a non, preserved from error, but still definitively taught. Like there are these weird nuances between like what has to be believed and what can be questioned.
Anything that's definitively proposed has to be free from all error. Because the magisterium cannot definitively require an irrevocable assent on your part to something that's erroneous. Yeah. I mean, that would just destroy the credibility of the church. So if it's definitively proposed, it's free from error. But your question, effectively, if I understand it correctly, is: are there what's called defining acts and non-defining acts of the magisterium? I think that's kind of what you're asking, and I would say yes. If you look at the commentary on the concluding paragraphs of the Professio Fidei issued by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, probably my most favorite document, it speaks about the magisterium teaching with a defining act and a non-defining act. And what that means is, defining act is I'm going to teach something in a solemn way, like something ex cathedra, or if we're talking about an ecumenical council, a canon with an anathema, or a profession of faith, or something like this sacred council teaches, and it's clear that this is an irrevocable teaching. Those would be defining acts of the magisterium. They're solemn teachings. But then there's also non-defining acts of the magisterium. They're not solemnly taught anywhere. Like you can't point to a canon or a profession of faith or an ex cathedra teaching. But what you can do is point to the constant teaching throughout the ages of the bishops in communion with the Pope who have asserted this as something definitive. And
this is the ordinary versus the extraordinary.
This would be what we would call the ordinary and universal magisterium. Exactly.
Okay.
The organ of it, of course, is the episcopate, and it does so in a non-defining way, what we would call the ordinary and universal magisterium, where it has effectively always taught this. Maybe not in a definition, maybe not in a canon, maybe not in an ex cathedra teaching, but it's always taught it. For example, I'll give you a perfect example. Prior to the definition of Pius XII on the Assumption, Pius XII tells us that the teaching on the Assumption of Mary was ordinary and universal magisterium. So in other words, prior to that ex cathedra teaching, if you want to know what was taught definitively with a non-defining act, the Assumption of Mary. The bishops maintained that universally. Another example is prior to Nicaea 1, that Jesus is consubstantial with the Father, that he's one with the Father in essence. Prior to that being taught at Nicaea, that was taught by the Ordinary and Universal Magisterium as something definitive. Like you couldn't call that into question even before Nicaea 1, because it's taught in a non-defining act by the Ordinary and Universal Magisterium. Whereas after Nicaea 1, it's taught with a defining act.
Gotcha. All right. Thank you. That needed clarification. All right. So we've talked about the episcopate, specifically also how they relate to the priesthood and what that separation is there. Let's talk about the laity for a second,
Sure.
Since that's probably 90% of anyone's audience here. So in the laity, we got a couple different classifications. We've got the visible church and the invisible church. We've got the church militant, suffering, and triumphant. And then we have lay people. And we have lay people that are part of lay movements as well. So they may be lay religious, okay? Let's start off with the visible and invisible church. This is kind of like this gets to a favorite topic of yours, which is non-salus extra ecclesia. Can you be saved outside the church? You want to talk about that for a second?
Yeah, absolutely. What aspect in particular? Because there's so many things I can say about that one.
So let's see if I can summarize a brief history of this phrase. Non salus extra ecclesia, no salvation outside the church. Back in the day, that was like hardcore. If you are not a Catholic, you are going to hell. And then there were some side exceptions and understandings that like, okay, well maybe like, hey, we just discovered this place. Let's buy Amerigo Vespucci. Maybe it's America, and maybe there are these people there that had never encountered Christ before because they were literally separated by the other side of that world. Okay, fine. And then one potential reading of Lumen Gentium is that strict reading has since been lessened, and that you have various Protestant brothers and sisters, perhaps even atheists, if you want to take Pope Francis's words out of context, who could be saved without being part of the structure of the Catholic Church headed by Pope Francis today.
Yeah, so many things to say here. I would say that just in brief, some assumptions were made in the past prior to the discovery of the New World that are no longer taken for granted. And since pretty much the 1500s, the discovery of the New World, those assumptions have been challenged, and they really culminate in the Second Vatican Council, where they're no longer taken for granted, and we're making explicit some of those challenges. In other words, it's always the case, and it will always be the case, that there's only salvation in the church. You can't be saved unless you're a member of the church. That's always going to be true. That's dogma. What's being challenged is it the case that you have to be a formal card-carrying Catholic to be a member of the church to be saved? In other words, when we speak about you have to be a member of the church, does that mean you have to be a card-carrying Catholic, a formal member? That was assumed, and it should no longer be assumed. It's still the case that you have to be a member of the church. But what it means to be a member of the church is what has been developed and has been developing for over 500 years. And we see in Vatican II where it's effectively saying, okay, well, somebody could be a member of the church, and they're going to have their salvation as a member of the church, but they might not be a formal member. Whether or not that extends to atheists, I don't think so. If you read Vatican II, it speaks about people who have not yet arrived at an explicit knowledge of God. But that's not the same as atheism, right? Somebody who's not yet arrived at an explicit knowledge of God is more described as an agnostic than an atheist. An atheist is somebody who is explicitly saying, I reject any being known as God. So I would maybe question if somebody were to say, well, Vatican II teaches that an atheist could be a member of the church. I would push back on that and say, actually, I don't think it's necessarily saying that. Moreover, it's not saying that they remain in this state of ignorance until the moment of their death. It never says that. It doesn't say either way. I think that it's the case that all it's saying is grace is available to them, which, yeah, of course it's available to them. But I don't think that they remain in that state of ignorance prior to their death. I think that prior to their death, they're going to come to an explicit knowledge of God. And, but yeah, so much more can be said about that.
So this is one thing that I've really appreciated doing this podcast. So like I was just kind of reading through the Second Vatican Council documents on my own before I decided to do this podcast. And since doing it, just kind of on a lark, I was like, I need more material. Let's go through the references. And I got to say, I think the references is where the money is because, so I'm having trouble finding it right now, but in Lumen Gentium where it says the thing about like, you don't have to be part of, the physical structure of the church to be saved still. And it goes into that. There are some, maybe ambiguous ways, some solution agnostic ways that you can read that to say, hey, just believe in God and you're good, and you've commented about that at length. So I don't need to get into that explicitly. My point is more the references at that section of Lumen Gentium clarify immensely what the church is trying to say. Because, it goes through things like, hey, you know what? If you're not you can be part of the physical structure of the church, but be so against the practice and of what it teaches that you are effectively not part of it. And so you are not saved. You do not appeal to the saving graces of the church. And you could be outside the physical structures of the church, but appeal to the method of living so perfectly that you are saved by the grace of the church. And so we still have the applicable part of non salus extra ecclesia. Sure, no problem. And then another reference goes on, it's like, yeah, but you really can't count on that, man. Like, invincible ignorance is difficult to attain. That is bonkers hard, man. So like, there's this. I used to love that quote by the Venerable Archbishop Fulton Sheen, which was like, there are today, 1 million people who hate what they incorrectly regard as the Catholic Church. There are probably 10 who hate the actual Catholic Church, Something I've become pretty obsessed with is like, what are your responsibilities?
Yeah.
And the average person today has the capability to find information and understand what they read, so that, man, if you hate your misperception of the Catholic Church and you just run with that for 40 years and never question it, like, no, you don't qualify for invincible ignorance. I'm sorry, man. You didn't act according to your own responsibility. I'm sorry. Non salus extra ecclesia, you're out.
But, invincible ignorance, even though I do think there are not as many people who are invincibly ignorant as we tend to think, even though I do think that, let's just assume for a moment that the majority of mankind are invincibly ignorant. Let's just pretend that for a moment.
Okay.
That still doesn't answer the question, are they a member of the church? Because I could be invincibly ignorant about the truth claims of the Catholic Church and sin against my conscience every second, right?
Okay.
That's also necessary. Invincible ignorance just means you're not culpable for not knowing that you need to be a card-carrying Catholic. That's all invincible. Okay. But that doesn't mean you're saved, because you could murder people and fight against your conscience every hour of every day and be invincibly ignorant. Are you going to heaven? No, you're going against your conscience. You're going against the natural law. You're completely violating the light that you do have. So just because somebody's invincibly ignorant doesn't automatically mean they go to heaven. And a lot of people, they think that. They could think, oh, well, this person's invincibly ignorant, so they're good to go. Not necessarily. Wait, even if they are they really following their conscience? How many people do that? I mean, I know me, I struggle following my conscience sometimes. So, I mean, how many people out there are struggling with that as well? So, but be that as it may, yes, I still want to say that, okay, a fair amount of people could still be invincibly ignorant, but the question still is, are they infused with faith, hope, and charity in some extraordinary way? Are they following their conscience? Are they readily disposed to assent to God if they had known that they need to be a formal member? Those are still things that need to be brought out. In fact, if you read the Holy Office, 1949, it issued a document in response to Father Feeney from the St. Benedict Center. It goes over all of these conditions. It goes over, one must be invincibly ignorant. They must be have at least implicit faith, infused with faith, hope, and charity in some extraordinary way, perhaps. Following their conscience. It gives all of the different conditions that we have to keep in mind when we read Lumen Gentium, because Lumen Gentium was, of course, after that 1949 document.
So this is like, so chapter 2 is about on the people of God. So you can be part of the Catholic Church, but that doesn't mean you're part of the people of God. And the people of God subsists in the Catholic, what we call today the Catholic Church, the physical confines of it. So, like, if you're invincibly ignorant of the need for the Catholic Church, you still need to be part of the people of God. And that's what you're getting at with, respecting your conscience and abiding by it, and then being imbued with faith, hope, and charity. Gotcha. Rock on.
Yeah, there's a bunch of different ways we can qualify it. Formal versus informal members of the church, somebody who's participating in the soul of the church rather than its body. There's a bunch of different ways we can qualify it, but at the end of the day, a person who's going to be saved is a person who has faith, hope, and charity, right? They're following their conscience. They're not violating it. They're in communion with God.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Hey, so we're at an hour now, and I'm going to respect your time. So, ladies and gentlemen, Michael Lofton, thank you so much for coming on board with us today. This was absolutely wonderful and always a joy to listen to you. Hey, can we get some shameless plugs for you? Websites, your podcast, your YouTube channel, social media, what you got?
And by the way, I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for having me.
Reason
and Theology.com is the website. And of course, you could also go to just YouTube and type in Reason and Theology, and it will come right up. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. You'll see all kinds of different shows that we've done to date, and many more that are coming up.
Yeah. Actually, you've got a show coming up right at the end of this recording, which this recording is going to be released in like a month and a half. So yours will be released tonight or tomorrow or something.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. I intend to do one on the question of whether or not the law is salvific for Jews.
Ooh, yeah.
And the way I'm going to phrase it is the Torah a way of salvation for the Jews? And there's a document that was recently released by Cardinal Koch that uses that phrase, and that's why I'm asking the question. Is the Torah a way of salvation for the Jews? So that's why I intend to do it just a little bit.
Cool. Hey, thanks, man. Thanks once again. Hey, everyone, go check out Michael Lofton's channel. Check out his podcast. And with that, have a good night.
Thank you.